Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak with each one to one. Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Police Commissioner Ray Kelly proudly announced that the city's crime rate is going down. In fact, New York is considered the safest large city in America. But that doesn't mean there isn't crime, and there's certainly punishment. And what does that mean for those in our prisons? We'll learn what they have to deal with and how their issues are being addressed by the Correctional Association of New York, which serves as an independent monitor of conditions in the state prisons. Its new executive director, Soffiyah Elijah, is a native New Yorker who brings a wealth of experience as lawyer and academic. She left Harvard University Law School's Criminal Justice Institute to come home, and we're delighted that she has brought her expertise and passion to this 167-year-old organization. Welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us about the mission of the Correctional Association of New York.
The mission of the Correctional Association is to ensure that through criminal justice reform, the conditions in the prisons are the most humane possible. And certainly part of that is to ensure that the programming that exists inside the prisons provides for successful reentry into our communities.
And you do that, I gather, through research that you do on prisons. I would imagine you do some lobbying and advocating.
Yes.
On behalf of the prisoners. How many prisons are we talking about, and how many inmates are we talking about?
There's about 68 prisons throughout the New York State system, over 60,000 men, and about 1,500 women in the New York State system.
And where does the Correctional Association get its fund? Is it a nonprofit, private nonprofit?
It's a private, not-for-profit organization. Almost all of our funding comes from private donors and foundations. A very small amount comes from government funding, but that does not fund our core activities.
And you don't monitor the juvenile detention facilities. We're talking about adult facilities, correct?
That's correct. We do a lot of work in juvenile reform, but our mission doesn't include monitoring of the juvenile facilities yet.
Now, the number of annual prison commitments in New York State, after rising sharply in the 80s and early 90s, has been declining since the mid-90s. Why is that?
Well, crime is down. That's a major piece of it. And as the discussion throughout the country has become more informed about how best to deal with what we would call perhaps antisocial behavior, the public and the policymakers are starting to understand that there are alternatives to incarceration that most of the time work much better than incarceration, and that the majority of the people who are in need of some kind of, I'll say, correction can do so in the community and do not need to be incarcerated.
Now, Governor Cuomo recently announced his intentions to reduce the number of prison beds by 3,700, and also to reduce the number of beds in juvenile institutions. And I was just reading a Daily News article today that said the prisons currently have 8,000 excess beds. You support this scaling back, don't you?
We definitely do. We support downsizing. It doesn't make sense, and we agree with the governor's assessment that paying to keep unused beds open is a waste of the taxpayers' dollars.
In fact, I think I read about in that same article about one women's prison that has more staff than it has inmates.
That's correct.
I would imagine there would probably be some opposition to this proposal, especially from upstate communities.
There's a tremendous amount of opposition from upstate communities, and that's due in part because the prisons provide an income stream for those communities because they provide jobs. And fortunately, the governor has proposed economic development money to go to those communities to offset the economic impact of closing the beds in those facilities.
How would you like to see this reduction? I mean, eliminating 3,700 beds or even 8,000 beds. How would you like to see this process proceed? I assume that this would be something that your organization would take some part in.
Yes, yes. So we have identified certain criteria that we think are essential to the governors making the decision as to what facilities to close. And perhaps the number one criteria is the proximity of the facility to New York City or to the community where the prisoners come from. Now, we have found that the majority of the incarcerated population comes from New York City. So we're particularly concerned that facilities that are in close proximity to New York City not be closed. And one of the reasons is the importance of maintaining family ties and strengthening those ties. And when the family has to travel to distant places, the likelihood that they're going to be able to do so is greatly limited because most of the prisoners come from poor families, and the financial strain to be able to travel, for instance, say to Buffalo to visit Wendy or Attica is much more challenging than to be able to go, for instance, to Ossining and to Sing Sing or to Sullivan. So that's our first criteria. Certainly another concern is whether or not the facility provides adequate programming to ensure successful reentry. Has to be a major concern, and the efficiency with which the facility is run. Those are some of the criteria that we've identified that we hope the governor will take into consideration.
Now, a recent Correctional Association report found that as many as 3/4 of the state's prison inmates require drug counseling or treatment, but that few of them are receiving it, at least adequately. What needs to be done there?
Well, a more particularized analysis of the treatment needs of the prisoners needs to be done. So, for instance, it may be the case that 3/4 of the prisoners entering the facilities at some time had a drug problem. But say if someone's been incarcerated some 10 or 20 years, that problem is very different than the problem that exists for the person who's coming in and has only been there, say, for a year. So the person who has been incarcerated for, say, 20 years needs help making sure that they don't start to abuse substances when they are released, as opposed to the person who's struggling with the initial addiction. And unfortunately, the programs that exist right now are kind of cookie cutter so that everybody gets the same kind of treatment. So we're hoping that a more particularized treatment program will be implemented.
Now, one of the goals that the Correctional Association was campaigning, one of its primary goals that it was campaigning for many years was reform of the highly punitive Rockefeller drug laws. And I guess over the last 10 years or so, you got that reform. I think
Yes.
it was complete in 2009. How have those reforms affected the state prisons?
Well, the work is not finished. The implementation of the change in the laws is the next phase that's so very important. So, for instance, people who were sentenced under the Rockefeller drug laws now need to be able to get access to the courts to get resentenced. And that's a large number of people. And trainings need to be done for judges and advocates to make sure that the reform actually is put into place. So it's going to be a while before we can really measure the full impact of the change in the law.
Have these appeals started, and have there been some people who've actually gotten out under the reforms?
I don't know if anyone has gotten out. Well, I should say that some have, but it's been a slow trickle because the change is slow.
Another long sought-after goal of the Correctional Association was reform of the state prison phone system, which is something that I wrote about a lot when I was a columnist for Newsday. I know in the old days, I guess one company had a monopoly, on all the prison phone systems. Prisoners could only collect calls, and for which they were charged large amount of money, and you had families who had these $300 and $400 and $500 a month phone bills, and meanwhile, I think the phone companies kicked back a portion of their earnings to the prison system, and it was very onerous. for prisoners' families. But that also was reformed. Do we have a better system now? And
it is better. Fortunately, Governor Patterson passed legislation that took away that monopoly and took away those onerous fees that were being charged to families in those collect phone calls. So now the charges to the families are far more affordable, and the prisoners are not having the same problem with maintaining that access to their families through the phones.
In the mid-90s, in the midst of a Get Tough on Criminals campaign, public funding for college-level courses in prison, for prison inmates, I gather, was eliminated. Are college inmates in New York State now able to take college-level courses? Are they available?
In a few facilities, not nearly enough, and we're hoping that that will expand. It's very clear that perhaps the most important factor to guarantee successful reentry is education and vocational training while incarcerated. We're encouraged by the fact that the current Commissioner of Corrections, Brian Fisher, finds education to be a very important aspect of a prisoner's experience while incarcerated, and that he encourages access to educational opportunities. And we're hoping that those opportunities will be expanded throughout the system, because, as I said, there's only about 6 facilities where they exist now.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. How about psychiatric and psychological treatment services for the inmates? I know that a recent report found that these kinds of services for the juvenile facilities were almost non-existent. Do you get, and obviously you have a lot of inmates, I would think, who would need some kind of psychological therapy, counseling, I mean, from professionals.
That's correct.
Do they get it?
They don't get nearly enough of it. In fact, this is a subject of an extensive study by the Correctional Association, and the challenge is that the need far exceeds the availability. I would say half to 3/4 of the prisoners who come in suffer from a range from depression to severe mental illness, and Department of Corrections is just not equipped sufficiently to meet all of those needs. Many of these people really would be better served in a mental health facility, and the intersection between the Department of Mental Health and Department of Corrections is not dovetailed well enough, and there's not enough diversion for people who have serious mental health issues out of the criminal court system into the mental health system.
Is this a matter of resources, not wanting to pay for it?
In large measure, it's a matter of resources. And then there's also the concern, the media talks a lot about public safety and doesn't really address what this distinction is for people who really need mental health counseling as opposed to being incarceration.
Locked up.
Exactly. So we need a more educated public on this issue.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more with Soffiyah Elijah, Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, after the following message.
Here we go. What? What?
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent, because kids in foster care don't need perfection. They need you.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Soffiyah Elijah, Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York. During the break, you were telling me some interesting things about this whole need for, or rather the difficulty of getting sufficient psychiatric and psychological services to inmates in prison.
Yes, I was saying that many of the people who are incarcerated due to their mental health issues, and they really need treatment in a mental health facility rather than incarceration, where they're going to get little to no treatment for their condition. Now, part of the problem is the Department of Mental Health feels that it cannot adequately house these people and says that they are dangerous and therefore not suitable for housing in mental health facilities. And the Department of Corrections does not have the funding for the type of one-on-one and small group counseling that's really required to assist people who have significant mental health issues.
And oftentimes, I mean, I get the feeling that whatever kinds of programs you have in prison, they're sort of counseling programs, group counseling programs, often led by somebody who's not trained as a psychiatrist or a psychologist, maybe a social worker, that kind of thing, as opposed to the intense kind of counseling and treatment that a lot of these inmates would need.
That's correct. And Department of Corrections just does not have the funding and the personnel. Now, there is some change coming with respect to hiring more professionals to meet this need, but the need is far greater than the change is going to be able to address.
Mm-hmm. So would you have a prison, for instance, that would have maybe only one psychologist or one psychiatrist on duty, if that?
In some instances, you don't have more than that. That's a good facility. And in other instances, you have a licensed social worker to deal with the population that's in need of mental health services, which is usually far inadequate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, the Correctional Association runs a Women in Prison project. What does the project do, and why a special program for women?
Well, we do. We have a Women in Prison coalition that is a statewide coalition. There's over 60 members of the coalition. Involves individuals, organizations, and stakeholders throughout the state. And we work on a number of issues particularized to women, because although women comprise a small percentage of the incarcerated population—
How many again?
About 1,500.
Okay.
Their needs are very particularized and not generally met by the larger policies of the Department of Corrections, unless you have advocates who are dealing specifically with women's issues. So, for instance, a major piece of the successful work of the coalition was to push for legislation to do away with shackling of women while they're in labor. Another effort has been, another piece that we're working on now is called the Domestic Violence Survivors Act, which is a piece of legislation that we'll be lobbying for, so that women and others who find themselves in the criminal justice system, because domestic violence is a central factor in the underlying reasons for the crime for which they're charged, they can petition for the court to sentence them to non-incarcerated time or alternatives to incarceration, because domestic violence is a key factor in their case.
Women who have perhaps killed an abusive husband or boyfriend.
Yes.
That's interesting, because I've written on cases like that, and it really seemed to me that we have situations where a victim of domestic violence, chronic domestic violence, finally kills their tormentor, that the current law on self-defense really is not adequate to address a lot of those cases.
That's correct.
That the law is geared to people, well, if he's coming at you now with a deadly weapon or whatever, and you have no way, if you can't effect an escape, then you have the right to defend yourself.
Right.
But otherwise, if it's somebody who's been beating you routinely, attacking you routinely, and you finally have enough or snap or whatever, then
that's correct.
You go away for second-degree murder.
It's almost like this is the next step in educating the public and the courts after the battered women syndrome, which took quite a bit of time to get the courts to be sensitive to. So now we have to deal with the realities of people for whom domestic violence was a key factor in the crime that they're charged with.
You came here from Harvard Law's Criminal Justice Institute, where you train law students to be effective and ethical lawyers, presumably those who are interested in criminal law, and to work for juvenile and criminal justice reform. Tell me about the kinds of things you try to instill in these students.
Okay, well, certainly a respect and adherence to the ethical parameters within which we do this work, but also a real empathy for the people that they represent, and to understand the lives of their clients. Most of my students, particularly at Harvard Law School, came from comfortable lifestyles, and their clients, by and large, did not. And it was important to me that in order for the students to give really quality and zealous representation, they had to understand from whence their clients came. I also instilled in my students a respect for being prepared to the very best of their ability, that their clients, whether their clients paid them a hefty sum or they were court-appointed lawyers, that their clients were entitled to zealous representation and a true commitment to providing them with the very best research and advocacy available.
Do you have a lot of Harvard law students who are interested in criminal law?
Well, I can say that a high percentage of the students who came through this clinic were interested in criminal law, but the clinical offerings, I think Harvard had some 63 clinical offerings, and a smaller percentage of that group of students who wanted to take a clinic came to the Criminal Justice Institute. But we were always oversubscribed in the number of students who came into the clinic, and that was encouraging that more and more students were interested in pursuing this field.
How about in terms of students, law students are interested in, nationwide, interested in going to criminal law?
Well, across the country, actually, you see this trend that more students...
Upward, trending upward?
Trending upward,
okay.
Yes. That more students are finding this to be an interesting field to pursue. There was a time when most students coming into law school wanted to go the corporate route, but the interest in doing public interest work has increased, and the law schools have been more supportive of this by giving loan forgiveness for students who did a certain number of years working in public interest after graduation.
I just wanted to go back just a step. You know, we were talking about women who are incarcerated. And it seems to me, from my experience, you know, I've read so many stories in the New York Times and elsewhere about the wives and girlfriends of male prisoners taking that long trip, 9-hour bus trip, you know, upstate once a month or twice a month. My sense is that many of the women who are in prison almost never get visitors. You know, they're pretty much there and that's it.
There's far fewer visits for the women, and there's a number of reasons for that. Because of the over-incarceration of the men, many of the men who were their husbands or boyfriends are incarcerated, so they're not able to visit. Then what's left primarily is family, mostly parents, and many of them are up in years, so it's more of a strain for them to make that trek. So you have several factors that impact the reality that women have fewer visits. And then also many of the women who are incarcerated have children who are being cared for by the parent or the aunt or the grandmother. And so then the challenge is, can that family member bring the child to the visit that could be many, many miles away from the home?
Right. Now we have about 2 minutes left, but I want to ask you a big question, which is, where are the areas where you see the most pressing need for reform in the whole criminal justice and prison area?
Well, in addition to just the general conditions to make sure that people are being treated humanely, is certainly education is a big one, and then I would say parole, because we are incarcerating and spending thousands of dollars each year to continue to incarcerate people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the research shows clearly that recidivism drops drastically after someone hits 40 years old. So we need to take a hard look at whether or not community supervision would be a smarter and wiser way of monitoring and ensuring public safety, and not the $55,000 to $75,000 a year that it costs to incarcerate someone who no longer really needs incarceration.
We're looking at budget problems, certainly nationwide, but also specifically in New York State and in New York City. Do the state prisons stand to be hurt by the current budget crisis?
I don't know if I would use the word hurt. I think that the correction system can be improved by downsizing, closing those beds that we don't need. We're encouraged by the fact that the governor has said 3,700 beds are slotted to be closed. As you mentioned earlier, there's 8,000 that are unused, so we have another 4,300 to go. And I think that that will assist the commissioner in focusing the funds that are available to implement the programming necessary to improve conditions and ensure that our most valuable human resource, the individuals who are incarcerated, can come home to society and be contributing members to the society.
Are there any particular future projects that you are hoping to institute at the Correctional Association?
There's a couple. There's several. I'll talk about a couple. One is that I think that the Correctional Association is well positioned to be a national model for other states. There's only two states that have an entity like the Correctional Association. The other one's in Pennsylvania. I think that the fact that we do independent monitoring of the prisons is an important factor that every state needs, and I'm hoping that what we do can be replicated across the country.
Well, I'm sorry, we're out of time. It's certainly an interesting area, one ripe with problems and the potential for reform. So I want to thank Soffiyah Elijah, Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, for joining me today. If you'd like more information, go to the organization's website at correctionalassociation.org. For One to One and the City University of New York, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.